Marcus Thompson stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his casual weekend attire, a neat polo shirt and pressed khaki pants. Even on his day off, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 8 years of experience as a federal prosecutor. Today was supposed to be simple, just a quick trip to the courthouse to file some personal property documents. The autumn morning greeted him with gentle sunlight as he pulled his modest Honda Civic into the courthouse parking lot. Marcus had purposely chosen to handle his personal business on a Saturday, hoping to avoid the usual weekday rush. As he walked toward the entrance, he noticed how different the atmosphere felt when he wasn't wearing his usual formal suit and carrying his Justice Department badge. At the security checkpoint, Marcus observed the subtle shift in the guard's expressions. Officer Pete, who normally greeted him with a cheerful "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," on weekdays, now eyed him with suspicious scrutiny. The guard's hand rested a little too eagerly on his belt as Marcus passed through the metal detector. "Arms out, sir," the second guard commanded, despite the detector remaining silent. Marcus complied without complaint, having experienced such random checks before. He maintained his composure as they waved the handheld detector across his body for the second time. "Purpose of your visit?" the guard questioned, holding Marcus's driver's license longer than necessary. "Filing property documents at the clerk's office," Marcus replied calmly, noticing how the guard's eyes darted between his face and the ID photo, as if searching for inconsistencies. Finally cleared to enter, Marcus walked through the quiet hallways, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The courthouse felt different on weekends, emptier, more imposing. A skeleton crew of staff moved about, their curious glances following him as he passed. Reaching the information desk, Marcus found an elderly clerk he didn't recognize. "Excuse me, I need directions to the Property Records Division," he said politely. The clerk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle. "Third floor, courtroom 3. They're handling all administrative matters today due to renovations in the clerk's office." She waved him off with a dismissive hand. Marcus checked his watch, 10:15 a.m. The whole process shouldn't take more than 30 minutes, leaving him plenty of time to make it to his nephew's basketball game at noon. He took the stairs instead of waiting for the elevator, his mind already on the upcoming game. The third floor seemed eerily quiet. Following the posted signs, Marcus approached courtroom 3. The heavy wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, the sound echoing through the nearly empty chamber. To his surprise, a small court session appeared to be in progress. Judge William Barrett, a man Marcus had heard about but never appeared before, sat on the bench. The judge's steel-gray hair and stern expression matched the rumors of his rigid demeanor. Several court staff members were scattered around, along with a few people who appeared to be waiting their turn for various administrative matters. Before Marcus could step back and check if he had the right room, Judge Barrett's sharp voice cut through the air. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with their presence." Marcus opened his mouth to explain his presence, but the judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you think court schedules are merely suggestions? That we all wait here at your convenience?" Confusion swept over Marcus as he realized the judge was addressing him as if he were an expected participant in the proceedings. He tried to speak again. "Your Honor, I apologize, but I'm here for..." Silence. Judge Barrett's gavel cracked against the sound block. "I've had enough of your disrespect. We've been waiting since 9 a.m. for case number 2347, and you stroll in here as if you're taking a casual walk in the park." The few people in the courtroom turned to stare at Marcus, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A young court clerk whispered something to her colleague, both of them watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his face a mask of professional calm. In his mind, he counted slowly to 10, a technique he'd learned long ago for dealing with such situations. He knew what was happening. He'd seen it before. But this time, something felt different. This time, he wasn't just going to let it slide. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor, as Judge Barrett prepared to deliver what he thought would be a routine scolding to just another tardy defendant. He had no idea he was about to make one of the biggest mistakes of his judicial career. Judge Barrett leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his face reddening with each passing second. The morning light caught the silver streaks in his hair as he glared down at Marcus, who remained perfectly still in the center of the courtroom. Case number 2347, public disturbance, the judge announced loudly, shuffling through papers he assumed were relevant. Not only are you over an hour late, but you have the audacity to appear in such casual attire. This is a court of law, not a shopping mall. Marcus took a careful breath, keeping his voice steady. Your Honor, if I could just explain. You'll speak when I tell you to speak. Judge Barrett's voice bounced off the courtroom walls. The few people present shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, her eyes darting between the judge and Marcus. The judge continued his tirade. I see this kind of disrespect far too often these days. People thinking they can just waltz in here on their own schedule, dressed like they're going to a backyard barbecue. He picked up a document from his desk, clearly not even related to Marcus, and waved it in the air. Sarah Chen, a veteran court clerk who had worked there for 20 years, noticed something was wrong. She recognized Marcus from his frequent appearances as a prosecutor, but before she could speak up, Judge Barrett was already declaring his judgment. $500, the judge announced, his gavel hovering threateningly. $500 for contempt of court, to be paid immediately. Maybe that will teach you the value of punctuality and proper court etiquette. Marcus's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. The muscles in his jaw tightened, but his voice remained remarkably calm. Your Honor, there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm not. A misunderstanding. Judge Barrett's laugh was sharp and dismissive. The only misunderstanding here is your belief that this court will tolerate such blatant disregard for its procedures. Do you need me to explain what contempt of court means? The condescension in the judge's voice made even the bailiff wince. Sarah Chen had finally found the courage to stand up. A folder clutched to her chest, but the judge waved her away without even looking at her. Your Honor, Marcus began again, his voice taking on a different tone, one that made several of the court veterans present sit up straighter. I am Federal Prosecutor Marcus Thompson from the United States Attorney's Office. I'm here to file property documents as the clerk's office is under renovation, and not your 9 a.m. case. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Barrett's face, which had been red with anger, suddenly drained of all color. His gavel, which he had been about to bring down again, froze midair. Sarah Chen quietly sank back into her chair, her hand covering her mouth. You're... For the first time that morning, the judge seemed at a loss for words. He frantically shuffled through his papers, as if hoping to find something to justify his actions. If you check your records, Marcus continued, his voice remaining professional but now carrying an unmistakable weight, you'll find that your 9 a.m. case, number 2347, already called to reschedule. That message should be on your desk somewhere. Sure enough, under the scattered papers on Judge Barrett's desk lay a bright pink message, slip noting the rescheduling request. The judge stared at it, then back at Marcus, then at the message again. The other people in the courtroom had become absolutely still, watching the scene unfold like witnesses to a slow-motion car crash. The young court reporter had stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen over her keyboard. I apologize, Mr. Thompson. Judge Barrett finally managed to say, his voice having lost all its previous authority. There has indeed been a grave error. Yes, Your Honor, there has. Marcus's response was simple but loaded with meaning. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his Justice Department ID, holding it up not just for the judge to see, but for everyone present to witness. The gold badge caught the morning light, sending a sharp reflection across the courtroom. Judge Barrett cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain his composure. The contempt charge is, of course, dismissed. And I want to extend my deepest. Thank you, Your Honor, Marcus interrupted calmly. But I think we should discuss this matter in your chambers, unless you prefer to continue this conversation here, in open court, with the recording running. The judge's face paled even further as he realized the full implications of what had just happened. He quickly nodded and rose from his bench, gesturing toward his chamber doors. As Marcus followed the judge toward his chambers, the courtroom remained silent, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The heavy oak door of Judge Barrett's chambers closed behind them with a soft click. The judge's private office was impressive, with walls lined with leather-bound law books and framed certificates. A large window overlooked the courthouse garden, where fallen autumn leaves danced in the morning breeze. Judge Barrett hurried behind his desk, pulling out his chair like a shield between himself and Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot begin to express my—" "Please, sit down, Your Honor," Marcus interrupted quietly, taking one of the leather chairs facing the desk. His calm demeanor somehow made the situation even more intense. "We have several things to discuss." The judge sank into his chair, his usual confidence completely gone. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, he felt like he was the one on trial. A thin layer of sweat appeared on his forehead as Marcus placed his Justice Department credentials on the desk between them. "Let's review what just happened out there," Marcus began, his voice measured and clear. "You saw a black man enter your courtroom in casual clothes. Without asking for his name or checking any documentation, you immediately assumed he was a defendant. Is that a fair assessment?" Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you, race had nothing to do with—" "Really?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "So you regularly fine white attorneys who enter your courtroom $500 without checking their identity first?" The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, they could hear the faint sounds of people walking in the hallway, completely unaware of the dramatic scene unfolding in the judge's chambers. "I had a case file in front of me," Judge Barrett tried to explain, his voice weak. "I was expecting a defendant for case number 2347. A case that was rescheduled," Marcus pointed out. "Something you would have known if you had taken even a moment to check your messages or ask for my name. Instead, you made assumptions. Dangerous assumptions, Your Honor." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin folder. "What's interesting is that this isn't the first time something like this has happened in your courtroom. Over the past month, I've received several complaints about similar incidents." The judge's face, which had started to regain some color, went pale again. "Complaints?" "Yes," Marcus continued, opening the folder. "3 African-American attorneys reported being mistaken for defendants in your court. 2 others were asked to show their bar credentials when their white colleagues weren't. All of these incidents are now part of an ongoing investigation by the Judicial Conduct Committee." Judge Barrett's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "An investigation? I wasn't aware." "You weren't supposed to be," Marcus replied. "But after today's incident, I think we need to address this directly. Your actions in the courtroom weren't just embarrassing, Your Honor. They were a demonstration of the exact kind of systemic bias we're working to eliminate from our justice system." A robin landed on the windowsill outside, its red breast bright against the gray autumn sky. Judge Barrett stared at it, seemingly lost in thought before speaking again. What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus straightened in his chair. "That depends partly on you, Your Honor. The incident in the courtroom today was recorded. The contempt charge you tried to impose on me is documented. I could file a formal complaint, which, combined with the other incidents we're investigating, would likely lead to a full review of your judicial conduct." The judge's shoulders slumped. 20 years of career achievements suddenly felt very fragile. However, Marcus continued, "I'm more interested in creating meaningful change than pursuing punishment. I want to know what you're going to do to address these biases in your courtroom." Judge Barrett looked up, surprise evident on his face. "You're giving me a chance to fix this." "I'm giving you a chance to be part of the solution," Marcus corrected him. "That starts with acknowledging the problem. Those people out there in your courtroom, they deserve better. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing." The judge nodded slowly, realization dawning on his face. This wasn't just about one mistake on a Saturday morning. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to change. "What do you suggest?" Judge Barrett asked, finally ready to listen. Marcus reached into his briefcase again, pulling out another document. "I have some ideas. But first, I want to hear your thoughts on what happened today. Real change starts with honest self-reflection, Your Honor." Outside the chamber doors, the courthouse continued its quiet Saturday routine, unaware that inside this room, a small but significant step toward justice was taking place. By Monday morning, news of the Saturday incident had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The story grew with each retelling: how federal prosecutor Marcus Thompson had been mistaken for a defendant, how Judge Barrett had tried to fine him, and how the whole scene had unfolded in front of witnesses. Linda Martinez, a veteran court reporter with 25 years of experience, sat in the courthouse cafeteria, surrounded by a group of eager listeners. "I heard it from Sarah Chen herself," she said, stirring her coffee. "The judge didn't even let Mr. Thompson speak before trying to slap him with that fine. Can you imagine? One of our most respected federal prosecutors." At a corner table, three young law clerks huddled over their phones, reading news articles that had already begun appearing on local legal blogs. The headline, "Federal Prosecutor Faces Discrimination in Local Court," glowed on their screens. Meanwhile, in the U.S. Attorney's office on the fifth floor, Marcus sat in his office, his phone ringing nonstop. Janet Wong, his colleague of 5 years, knocked on his open door. "Marcus, you got to see this," she said, walking in with her tablet. "The story's everywhere. The Black Lawyers Association just released a statement supporting you, and they're calling for a full investigation into judicial bias in the county courts." Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking at the family photo on his desk, him and his wife at their daughter's college graduation. "This was never about just me, Janet. This was about every person who walks into that courthouse and gets judged by their appearance rather than their character." His office phone rang again. This time, it was the chief judge of the district court, requesting an immediate meeting. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple weekend incident. In another part of the building, Judge Barrett sat alone in his chambers, staring at the growing pile of messages on his desk. His morning docket had been reassigned to another judge pending review. His secretary, Mrs. Anderson, had already fielded calls from 3 different news organizations. The judge picked up one of the messages, this one from his daughter, a civil rights attorney in Chicago. "Dad, we need to talk," it read simply. He could imagine her disappointment, and it hurt more than any official reprimand could. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert Chen, the court administrator, looking uncomfortable. "Judge Barrett, the Judicial Conduct Committee has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're requesting your presence, and all your case records from the past year." In the courthouse lobby, security guard Pete Watson, who had given Marcus extra scrutiny just 2 days ago, watched as a group of protesters began gathering outside. Their signs read, "Justice should be colorblind," and "End judicial bias now." Local news vans were starting to arrive, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky. Back in Marcus's office, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "You're trending on Twitter, honey. Your daughter says you're her hero." Again. He smiled, remembering the conversation at breakfast yesterday, how his teenage daughter had asked him why he wasn't angrier about what happened. Sometimes, he had told her, the best way to fight injustice is to expose it calmly and force people to face their own biases. Janet returned to his office, this time with more news. "Marcus, you won't believe this. 5 more attorneys have come forward with similar stories about Judge Barrett. And not just black attorneys. Hispanic and Asian lawyers, too. This is bigger than we thought." Marcus nodded, standing up to look out his window at the growing crowd below. "Change never comes easily, Janet, but sometimes it takes one incident to open everyone's eyes." His office phone rang once more. This time it was the State Bar Association, requesting him to be a keynote speaker at their upcoming conference on judicial reform. As he listened to their invitation, Marcus watched more protesters joining the group outside. Among them, he noticed several familiar faces, attorneys, court staff, and even some judges. "The aftermath is always the hardest part," he said to Janet after hanging up. "Now comes the real work, making sure this leads to actual change, not just headlines." On his desk, next to his family photo, lay the property documents he'd originally come to file that Saturday morning. They seemed almost trivial now, compared to what that simple errand had set in motion. Sometimes, Marcus realized, the most significant changes start with the smallest moments. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, their voices rising with demands for justice and change. Inside the courthouse, people went about their business, but nothing felt quite the same anymore. Something had shifted, like a first crack in a dam, small but significant, promising the possibility of greater change to come. The Judicial Review Board's conference room buzzed with tension on Thursday morning. 7 senior judges and legal experts sat around a massive oak table, their faces serious as they reviewed the growing stack of evidence before them. At the head of the table, Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez adjusted her reading glasses, studying the detailed report in front of her. Over the past 3 days, she announced to the room, we've received 23 formal complaints about Judge Barrett's conduct. Each case has been carefully documented. She held up a thick folder. What we're seeing here is not just about last Saturday's incident. Mark Chen, the court's data analyst, stepped forward with his laptop. His presentation appeared on the large screen behind him, showing colorful graphs and charts. Our initial analysis of Judge Barrett's last 3 years of cases shows some disturbing patterns, he explained, pointing to a bar graph. Minority defendants received, on average, 40% higher fines and 35% longer sentences for similar offenses. The room filled with murmurs as the board members studied the statistics. Judge Rodriguez called for silence before continuing. We also need to address the complaints from minority attorneys who appeared in his courtroom. Sarah Chen, the court clerk who had witnessed Saturday's incident, sat nervously in a chair against the wall, waiting to give her testimony. She had worked in Judge Barrett's courtroom for 5 years and had seen many things she could no longer keep quiet about. Ms. Chen, Judge Rodriguez called. Please tell the board what you've observed. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she stood. Over the past 5 years, I've noticed Judge Barrett consistently asking minority attorneys to show their credentials, while rarely questioning white attorneys. Last month alone, there were 6 incidents where he mistook minority lawyers for defendants. In another part of the courthouse, Marcus Thompson sat with the investigation team, reviewing security footage from Judge Barrett's courtroom. The team had collected videos from dozens of cases, showing a clear pattern of different treatment based on race. Look at this one, said investigator James Martinez, pointing to a screen. Last March, an Asian American attorney was held in contempt for being 5 minutes late, while the previous week, a white attorney was 15 minutes late and received only a verbal warning. Marcus made careful notes, his expression remaining professional. We need to be thorough, he reminded the team. This isn't about one judge anymore. This is about identifying and correcting systemic bias in our entire judicial system. Down the hall, Judge Barrett sat alone in a small conference room, reviewing his own case history with growing horror. Each file told the same story, unconscious bias affecting his decisions, prejudices he hadn't even realized he held showing up in case after case. His hands shook as he picked up another file. This one showed how he had denied bail to a black defendant for a minor offense, while granting it to a white defendant in an almost identical case the very next day. How did I not see this? He whispered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Dr. Angela Williams, a racial bias expert brought in by the review board. Judge Barrett, she said gently, are you ready to begin our session? Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, reporters gathered as more people came forward with their stories. Amanda Torres, a public defender, spoke to a local news crew about her experiences in Judge Barrett's courtroom. It wasn't just the big things, she explained. It was the small things too. The tone of voice, the assumptions made, the different levels of respect shown to different people based on their appearance. Back in the review boardroom, Judge Rodriguez closed another file and addressed her colleagues. This investigation has revealed more than just one judge's bias. It's shown us gaps in our entire system of oversight. She stood up, looking at each board member in turn. We need new protocols for monitoring judicial conduct, regular bias training for all court personnel, and a clear system for reporting and addressing discrimination. The investigation team worked late into the evening, their office lights glowing in the darkened courthouse. They knew their findings would affect not just Judge Barrett's future, but the future of the entire judicial system in their district. Marcus left the courthouse that evening, carrying a thick folder of evidence. As he walked to his car, he passed the wall where the courthouse's motto hung, "Equal justice under law." For the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. Maybe now, those words would start to mean something more. The investigation wasn't just about punishing one judge anymore. It had become a catalyst for examining the entire system, forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about justice in America. Judge William Barrett sat alone on a wooden bench in the courthouse garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was Friday evening, 1 week after the incident that had changed everything. The manila envelope in his hands contained the preliminary findings of the investigation, and its contents had shaken him to his core. His mind wandered back to a conversation he'd had with his daughter Rachel earlier that day. As a civil rights attorney in Chicago, she hadn't held back her thoughts. "Dad," she had said over the phone, her voice firm but caring, "do you remember when I was 12, and you taught me about justice? You said a judge must see with clear eyes and an open heart. What happened to that, Dad?" Now, sitting in the quiet garden, those words echoed in his mind. He opened the envelope again, though he had already memorized its contents. The statistics were undeniable. In the past 3 years, he had given minorities an average of 40% higher fines, questioned the credentials of minority attorneys 27 times more often than their white colleagues, and showed consistent patterns of bias in bail decisions. A gentle breeze rustled the autumn leaves around him as he remembered specific cases. There was the young black attorney he'd mistaken for a defendant last spring, the Hispanic law clerk he questioned about her right to be in the judge's chambers, and countless small moments of prejudice he'd never even noticed at the time. The garden door opened, and Dr. Angela Williams, the racial bias expert, walked out. She had been working with him all week, helping him understand his unconscious biases. Seeing him alone on the bench, she decided to join him. "Heavy reading?" she asked, gesturing to the envelope. Judge Barrett nodded slowly. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I always prided myself on being fair, on following the law, but these numbers, these stories, they tell a different story." Dr. Williams sat quietly, letting him continue. "You know what really gets me," he said, picking up a fallen leaf. "I never saw it. All these years, I was so convinced I was being impartial that I couldn't see my own prejudices staring me right in the face." He remembered Monday morning, when he finally gathered the courage to watch the security footage of his courtroom. He had seen himself through new eyes, the way his tone changed with different people, how his body language shifted, the assumptions he made based on appearance alone. "Recognition is the first step," Dr. Williams said gently. "Many people never even get this far." Inside the courthouse, the lights were still on in Marcus Thompson's office. The federal prosecutor had just finished reviewing Judge Barrett's written statement to the review board. The judge's words showed something unexpected, genuine reflection and remorse. Back in the garden, Judge Barrett stood up, walking to a small fountain nearby. His reflection rippled in the water as he spoke again. "Yesterday, I found an old photo from my first day as a judge," he told Dr. Williams. "I was so proud, so certain I would be different from the old guard. I would be fair, just, unbiased. When did I become exactly what I promised I wouldn't be?" A young janitor passed by, nodding respectfully. Judge Barrett noticed how he automatically tensed up at the sight of the young black man, a reaction he would have denied having just a week ago. "These responses," he said, turning to Dr. Williams, "they're so automatic. I didn't even know I was doing it." "That's why they're called unconscious biases," she replied. "But now that you see them, you can change them." The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the garden. Judge Barrett thought about all the people who had passed through his courtroom over the years. How many lives had been affected by his unexamined prejudices? How many careers had been made harder because of his assumptions? "My daughter asked me today if I was going to resign," he said quietly. Dr. Williams looked at him thoughtfully. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I don't know yet, but I do know this, whether I stay on the bench or not, I have work to do. Real work. Not just on myself, but to help others see what I was blind to for so long." As darkness fell over the courthouse garden, Judge Barrett stood up, gathering his papers. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more revelations, more uncomfortable truths to face. But for the first time in his career, he was truly seeing himself and his role in the justice system with clear eyes. The process of change had begun, not just in the courthouse's policies, but in the heart and mind of a judge who had finally learned to question his own judgments. The main hearing room of the Judicial Review Board was packed on Monday morning. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating rows of wooden benches filled with attorneys, court staff, and members of the public. At the front of the room, 7 board members sat behind a curved desk, their expressions serious. Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie as he prepared to give his testimony. Unlike the angry prosecutor many had expected to see, he carried himself with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout the entire process. His wife Sarah sat in the front row, holding a small notebook where she'd been documenting everything since that first Saturday. Chief Judge Rodriguez called the hearing to order, her gavel echoing through the hushed room. Today we examine the events of Saturday, November 9th, and the subsequent findings of our investigation into judicial conduct in this courthouse. Camera crews from local news stations lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. This wasn't just a routine hearing. It was a moment that would change their judicial district forever. Marcus stood at the podium, facing the board. "Distinguished members," he began, his voice clear and measured, "I'm not here today to seek punishment. I'm here because our system of justice needs healing." He opened a blue folder and began sharing his findings. Over the past 10 days, our investigation team has reviewed hundreds of cases. We found patterns of bias that went far beyond one incident or one judge. He placed documents on the evidence table, one by one. A Hispanic attorney asked to show her bar card 3 times in one day. A black defendant denied bail for the same offense that saw a white defendant released. An Asian law clerk repeatedly mistaken for a translator. Each example landed with quiet force. In the second row, Judge Barrett sat listening, his hands folded in his lap. His daughter Rachel had flown in from Chicago to sit beside him, her hand resting supportively on his arm. The judge looked different now, humbler, more aware. Marcus continued, displaying graphs and statistics on the large screen. "But here's what's important," he said, turning to face the whole room. When confronted with these findings, Judge Barrett did something remarkable. He listened. He learned. He acknowledged his biases. The room stirred with surprise. This wasn't the angry condemnation many had expected. Judge Barrett was called to testify next. He walked to the podium slowly, looking older than his 60 years. 10 days ago, he began, his voice slightly shaky, "I thought I was one of the good ones. I believe I treated everyone fairly. I was wrong." He shared his journey of self-discovery over the past week, the painful recognition of his biases, the late nights reviewing his past decisions, the honest conversations with his daughter about justice and privilege. "I'm not here to defend my actions," he said firmly. "I'm here to be accountable for them, and more importantly, to be part of the solution." Dr. Angela Williams, the racial bias expert, presented her recommendations next. "What we need isn't just punishment," she explained. "We need systematic change, regular bias training for all court personnel, anonymous reporting systems for discriminatory behavior, regular review of judicial decisions for patterns of bias." The board members took notes as she outlined a comprehensive plan for reform. This wasn't just about one judge anymore, it was about transforming the entire system. Near the end of the hearing, Marcus returned to the podium. "Your Honors," he said, looking at each board member, "we have a choice today. We can treat this as an isolated incident and move on, or we can use it as a catalyst for real change." He gestured to the packed room. "Look around. Everyone here, judges, attorneys, staff, citizens, we're all part of this system, and we all have a responsibility to make it better." The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Chief Judge Rodriguez delivered their decision. Judge Barrett would be suspended for 3 months, during which he would undergo intensive bias training. But more importantly, the board adopted all of Dr. Williams's recommended reforms. As people filed out of the hearing room, Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Judge Barrett. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said softly, "thank you for making this about change rather than vengeance." Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. "Sometimes," he replied, "accountability isn't about punishment, it's about growth." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to share the news. But the real story wasn't in the headlines about suspension or sanctions. The real story was in the quiet conversations happening throughout the building, about bias, about justice, about doing better. This was accountability in its truest form, not just facing consequences, but embracing the opportunity to create meaningful change. 6 months had passed since that fateful Saturday morning. The courthouse stood tall against the spring sky, its stone steps now adorned with fresh flower pots, a small but symbolic change representing new beginnings. Inside, the building hummed with a different kind of energy. Marcus Thompson walked through the main entrance, nodding to Security Officer Pete, who now greeted every visitor with the same respectful smile, regardless of their appearance. The changes were everywhere: some small, others significant, but all meaningful. Today was special. Judge Barrett was returning to the bench after completing his suspension and training program. But he wasn't returning to the same courthouse he'd left. The past 6 months had transformed the entire system. Marcus paused by the newly installed Equal Justice Resource Center on the first floor. The glass-walled room buzzed with activity as staff members helped visitors navigate the legal system. On its walls hung clear infographics in multiple languages explaining court procedures and rights. Mr. Thompson called out Maria Rodriguez, the center's new director. The latest numbers are in. Complaints about discriminatory treatment are down 75% since we implemented the new protocols. Marcus smiled, remembering how hard they'd worked to create these changes. The anonymous reporting system, regular bias training sessions, and monthly review of judicial decisions had all become standard practice. What started as one incident had sparked a revolution in their judicial district. Upstairs, Judge Barrett stood in his chambers, adjusting his robe. His daughter Rachel, who had moved back to town to work on judicial reform, helped straighten his collar. The past 6 months had changed him profoundly. The bias training hadn't been easy. Facing his prejudices had meant many uncomfortable moments and sleepless nights. "Ready, Dad?" Rachel asked, seeing his nervous expression. "Different kind of ready," he replied. "A better kind." His first case of the day was about to begin. As he entered his courtroom, he noticed the small changes. The new signs clearly displaying defendants' rights in multiple languages. The more diverse court staff. The bias training certificates displayed prominently on the wall. The gallery was full. Many had come to watch this moment, including several attorneys who had previously filed complaints about discriminatory treatment. But they weren't here to criticize. They were here to witness change in action. Marcus sat in the back row, next to Dr. Angela Williams, who had become the courthouse's permanent bias awareness consultant. They watched as Judge Barrett handled his first case, a property dispute between two small business owners. "Notice his language," Dr. Williams whispered to Marcus. "Neutral, respectful, focused on facts rather than assumptions." During the lunch break, the courthouse cafeteria hosted a special gathering. Judge Rodriguez stood before the assembled staff, holding up a report. 6 months ago, we faced a crisis, she announced. Today, we're becoming a model for other districts. Last week, 3 other courthouses requested our training materials. Judge Barrett took the podium next. His hands no longer shook when he spoke in public. He had learned to channel his nervousness into determination. 6 months ago, I was the problem, he began honestly. Today, I'm part of the solution. The real victory isn't my personal growth. It's the change I see in every corner of this building. He gestured to Marcus, sitting quietly in the audience. Mr. Thompson could have demanded my resignation. Instead, he showed all of us, that true justice includes the chance to learn and grow. After the gathering, Marcus walked through the courthouse one last time before heading home. He stopped by the wall where the motto "Equal Justice under Law" still hung. Below it now was a new addition: "Justice sees with clear eyes and an open heart." His phone buzzed, a message from his daughter. "Dad, my law school professor used your case as an example today. Real change happens one person at a time." Outside, spring flowers bloomed in the courthouse garden where Judge Barrett had spent so many hours reflecting. A group of law students toured the new resource center, their faces bright with hope for the future they would help shape. As Marcus drove home that evening, he thought about how one moment of injustice had led to waves of positive change. The courthouse wasn't perfect. No system created by humans ever could be, but it was better. More importantly, it was still improving, still growing, still learning. His wife met him at the door with a smile. "How was it?" she asked. Marcus looked back at the setting sun, thinking of all that had changed in 6 months. "It's not just a resolution," he replied. "It's a new beginning." And in courtrooms and corridors throughout the building, that new beginning was already unfolding, one case, one person, one moment at a time.